For the last, I don't know, a couple of weeks or so, been doing kind of a little series from the book of Romans, chapters 9, 10, and 11. That's why there's an olive tree behind me, which is also the symbol, the logo, I guess you'd call it, for roots and foundations. Because as Paul says in Romans 11, which we'll probably get to next week, or maybe the following week, who knows, Gentiles are the wild olive branch grafted into the domestic olive tree and are nourished by the roots. The roots, of course, are Torah, the prophets, and the writings. And so that's why the olive tree symbol, it also, of course, becomes about bearing fruit and so forth. So 9, 10, and 11, as you know, of Romans are about Israel. And we went through all of chapter 9 in a couple of sessions, but I had some technical difficulties along the way. But in 9, the summary of it basically is Paul is in anguish about his brethren in the flesh, that they were trying to achieve righteousness on their own and had, in general, not accepted the gospel. And he almost wishes he could be accursed if his brethren in the flesh were brought into the kingdom that Yeshua ushers in. And in 10 and 11, he goes on with that. And this is what we're going to get to. And it probably should start, or else the time gets away. So I'm going to bring up, if you've been on this site before, if you've been on this program before, you know that there's usually a teaching, and it usually involves a PowerPoint. And once in a while we have an interview, but most of the time it's a teaching with a PowerPoint. And if I can bring the PowerPoint up, here we go. Chapter 10, this is going to be about chapter 10, and it's called My Heart's Desire, because it comes from the first line of Romans chapter 10. And it's also a great song by my good friend Marty Goetz, who is also from the Cleveland area and has been one of the mainstays of Messianic music for a long time. He has a song called Brother, My Heart's Desire. And so Paul starts chapter 10 by saying this is his main desire. What he wants to do is get Israel saved, as we would say. In fact, he says in verse 1, brethren, my heart's desire and prayer to God for Israel is that they may be saved. Or some translations say that they might be saved. There's no greater prayer for any individual person or any group of people than to say we want to see them be saved. Here he's in anguish. In fact, in chapter 9, he talks about he has this overwhelming anguish day and night about his brothers. And of course, you know that he was a Pharisee. He called himself Pharisee of Pharisees, Hebrew of Hebrews, and didn't understand the message of Yeshua until the road to Damascus. But now he starts chapter 10 by saying, my desire is to see Israel be saved. So he has this deep love. He has this overwhelming concern for his people. And it's interesting, as in the immediate times that we're living in, we know that the number of believers in the land has been increasing, especially during and right after COVID. There are more believers. There are now 302, I think was the last number I saw, recognized congregations, whereas 40 or 50 years ago there were 3. There are many believers now in the IDF who are getting to speak with their comrades, and there's more of a messianic presence on the cable channels, the radio. There's more openness to learn about Messiah. And so we see, and this is going to become particularly important when we do chapter 11, because there's the tremendous prophetic line that all Israel will be saved. And in our time, it seems that we're moving toward that. But we see here at the beginning of 10, Paul is so concerned. He has this anguish and this sadness, and his whole heart's desire is that Israel be saved. After all, as he pointed out in chapter 9, they had all the covenant, the prophecies, the priesthood, the temple, the sacrifices, the oracles, the scrolls. They had all these things. Earlier in Romans, he says that of all the people that should have known Yeshua is the Messiah, it should have been the religious people, because they spent all their lives, all their time reading these scriptures, debating these scriptures. And this was not like 21st century Bible study that we see, which is all fluffy and cutesy. This was serious debate, word by word, that would go on for their whole lives. They had all the oracles. They had all the information. They had the covenant. And when Paul's writing this, Gentiles are coming to the Messiah, and the Gentiles had none of these things. But through the action of the Ruach, the Holy Spirit, Gentiles were brought into the kingdom. They were brought to faith in the Jewish Messiah. Really quite remarkable. And so Paul, of course, has this physical connection, familial connections, spiritual connections. He's raised in Tarsus, which had a significant Jewish population. He was raised in Judaism, raised in the covenant and the law, but it was a Greek city. It was in the Roman Empire. It was a crossroads. So he lived in the Greek culture. He could speak Greek, he could speak Latin, he could speak Hebrew, he could speak Aramaic. So he knew at least 4 languages, probably more. But his connection here that he is in anguish about is to his brethren, as he calls them, his brethren in the flesh. You know, we see, of course, Yeshua as Messiah is the brethren in the flesh that they, for the most part, rejected and continue to reject. When they made David king over all of Israel, the people of the other tribes other than Judah said, well, he's bone of our bone and flesh of our flesh. Just like you recall Adam said about Eve, but they made David king over all of Israel. Messiah's bone of their bone and flesh of their flesh. And it even goes back to Joseph, but I don't want to go into all of that now because I'll get sidetracked. But you can see the similarities, the types and shadows in Joseph's life as they prefigure Yeshua. But Paul had all of these connections, all of these concerns. And of course, he knows now that salvation is the important thing. Nothing's more important to his people or any people he had lived in Jerusalem for so long. He had studied at the temple from the time of his bar mitzvah until the road to Damascus. In Galatians chapter 1, he tells us no one was more zealous for the law than he was. No one was advancing in Judaism more than he was. He says in 1 Corinthians that he was called as an apostle, not like the others, but he was called, even though he wasn't worthy to be an apostle because he had persecuted the church. But he adds, by the grace of God, he was an apostle. And he's sometimes called the apostle, although he never walked around with Yeshua and the others. But he goes from this strict Pharisaical life to being the apostle of grace, the apostle to the Gentiles, and becomes probably the most instrumental person of the time to explain the new covenant and to bring people into the new covenant. But he goes back to his roots and says, I'm anguished about this. Verse 2, for I bear them witness that they have a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge. For they, being ignorant of God's righteousness and seeking to establish their own righteousness, have not submitted to the righteousness of God. For Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. So you remember, Yeshua himself says, don't think I've come to abolish the law. I've come to fulfill the law. He, as we've said in so many teachings here, even though he is the one who gave the law to Moses, when he is on earth in the flesh as Jesus of Nazareth, he subjects himself to the law. Whether it's circumcision, whether it's presentation, whether it's wearing a talit, whether it's wearing tefillin, he subjects himself to the law. The pilgrimage feast, the feast days, subjects himself to the law. And of course, he would have to do that because if he did not keep the law perfectly, he could not be the Messiah, because then he would not be unblemished. He would not be perfect. And so even though he, as God, gave the law to Moses, he subjected himself to the law when he was on earth, even becoming subordinate and submissive to Mary and Joseph. Really quite remarkable. So he's the fulfillment of the law because everything in the law pointed to him. And as Paul points out earlier in Romans in chapters 2 and 3, he says, don't think that the law is evil. Of course not. Don't think that something's wrong with the law. Of course not. The law is from God. The problem is not with the law. The problem is that we don't keep the law. The problem is that we're always in rebellion. And so this is the solution to the rebellion. So he says, Messiah is the end point of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. I always tell everyone that I teach a lot of Bible study groups and home groups and whatever. I always say, if you only want to memorize one verse in the Bible, it should be 2 Corinthians 5:21. It says, he made him who knew no sin to be sin, so that we might become the righteousness of God in him. Our righteousness is in Messiah. It's not our own accomplishment, whatever you want to call it. We don't ever do such an amazing work that we're considered righteous. And our righteousness is in him. And here's one example that Paul tells us that it is by faith. For Messiah is the end point of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. So if you believe in him, you've repented of your sin, you've elected to follow him, you've become a disciple, that's where your righteousness lies. Even though you're still going to have your frail humanity and your nature of Adam that you carry around. So he says, what the Hebrews, the Israelites of the time, haven't grasped at this point is they're still trying to be righteous by following the law rather than understanding that they have to submit to Messiah in order to be righteous. In order to be righteous. Without Messiah, you can't be, without Messiah, in order to be saved, you would have to be completely righteous. Which, of course, no one can do. And so he says this is the distinction. They're trying to be righteous on their own work. When, number one, that's not possible. And number two, he points out God has provided a different way. So it says they're ignorant of God's righteousness. So they want to make their own righteousness. It leads to the scrupulous following of the law. We have plenty of Christian churches that are scrupulous about rules, regulations, and so forth. But Paul says the righteousness is in him. It isn't in you. So he says they had a great zeal about this, and as they should. They have a great love for the law. Because, of course, that was the covenant. They were the only people that had the covenant. They were the only people that had the law. The law was from God. It was only for them. The Gentiles had no covenant. There were people called righteous Gentiles, like the centurions and Cornelius, and I'm sure many others. They were called righteous Gentiles. They were called God-fearing Gentiles. Gentiles who realized that the God of Israel was the true God and that there are hundreds of pagan gods. It's kind of silly. Kind of understood this. But for the most part, well, for every part, the Gentiles had no covenant. No covenant. And so they were outside of the community. You know, in today's terms, we say outside the church, outside the body of believers, so to speak. And the Jews who were finding their own righteousness, that had the great zeal for the law, didn't understand how this was going to lead to Messiah. If you just try a little harder, you do a little better with this law, and you do a little bit better with that law. And you make sure you got everything on right and everything cooked right and everything done right. And then maybe you'll be acceptable. They couldn't see how this was going to lead to Messiah. So they were trying to be righteous, and they couldn't see how God was going to provide that. There's so many passages in the prophets that I should have made a list of them by then, especially in Isaiah and in the Psalms, about how he has become my salvation. When you're in a covenant of law, you don't say God has become your salvation. You say, well, I got to do better. I got to try harder with this. And you should try harder. You should, not minimizing the importance of the law, because it is important. You don't want to be one of these modern teachers in Christianity that say, well, it doesn't matter what you do, because that's clearly not biblical. But anyway, they couldn't understand how God was going to provide this righteousness, even though it's listed in the prophets. And at Paul's time, there is no way they could comprehend a crucified Redeemer, a crucified Messiah. This was totally alien thought to them. Even though there was Isaiah 52 and 53, and even though there was Zechariah chapter 12 and so many other things about a suffering Messiah, a suffering servant, they couldn't understand a crucified Redeemer. And as you know, there's many passages in all of the Tanakh about Messiah being a warrior, being a king. Well, that's what they wanted. So they didn't understand the suffering servant. And so I've been in many debates with Jewish friends, even a man at the Western Wall once some years ago in Jerusalem, that Isaiah 53 is not about Messiah, certainly not about Yeshua, but it's not even about Messiah. And the guy couldn't understand why I believe that a crucified Redeemer, because it made no sense in his mind. And so Paul outlines this. The Greek word that's used here for the end of the law is telos, the end part. When you study biology, there's a telos of many animals, which is kind of like the end of the animal, especially crustaceans. But he's the end of the law. He's the end point of the law. Everything pointed to him. He's a fulfillment of the law. And our righteousness comes through him. The law was prefiguring this. Paul says earlier in Romans, we should do the whole thing about Romans. Paul says earlier in Romans that the law defined what sin is. It was basically like looking in the mirror and realizing that you're not as righteous as you think. You're not nearly as holy as you think. And just because you're not as bad as the guy over there, and I don't do the stuff that guy does, doesn't make you righteous or holy. Because you look in the mirror and you see where your faults are. In the book of James, he has an interesting passage where he says, if you don't know the law, if you don't know the word, it's like looking in the mirror and then walking away from the mirror and forgetting what you looked like. You don't want to see that your imperfections and your shortcomings. You want to show everybody how awesome you are. And so all these things were shadows of what was going to come. But the law was fulfilled in Messiah. It was not destroyed. When you read Isaiah 55, you know that God says, my word never returns to me void. It always accomplishes something. The word isn't destroyed. His law is not destroyed because it's his word. Yeshua said, heaven and earth will pass away, but my word will not pass away. Well, the Torah, the books of the law, are his word. They're not going to pass away. They're a standard of holiness, Paul points out earlier in Romans. I'm not a theologian or a Bible scholar, so I don't know all the Latin and Greek terms and Hebrew terms, but basically the law is a measure of what you are. And because there's 613 of them, it's a pretty extensive measure. And shows you how difficult it is to be righteous and holy. And so the law is not destroyed because his word cannot be destroyed. But then the whole point of this whole argument is that you're justified by grace because of what Yeshua did. And so it's all of the book of Romans is a masterpiece. It's really a masterpiece. And so this is the point he's making about the Israelites trying to achieve their own righteousness. And these insignificant Gentiles who say, wow, I believe this now, because the Holy Spirit acted on them, told them that what this guy's telling you is really true, and that you really need this. You really need a Messiah. You need a Redeemer. And so this is a basic argument of this chapter. In Galatians 3, he sums it up by saying, therefore, the law was our tutor to bring us to Christ, that we might be justified by faith. Some translations say the law is our taskmaster that drives us to the cross. But the Greek has more the sense of a tutor who takes kids to school, make sure that they get to school. Tutors were very, very, very important in the ancient world. And rich people hired all kinds of tutors to teach their children. And in Galatians 3, Paul points out the law takes us to Messiah. Because we try hard, and we fail, and we fail, and we fail. Until finally you say, I can't do this. I want to do it, and I just can't do it. Paul himself says, the good I want to do, I don't do. The things I don't want to do, that's what I keep on doing. And that pretty much sums up everybody's life. Everybody's pretty much in that position. If you did all the things that you should be doing, that would be great. But instead, you do the things that you really don't want to do. Also earlier in Romans, I hate to keep saying that, but earlier in Romans, Paul says, in my head, I love the law and I want to follow the law. But in the rest of me, in my members, I say, man, I don't want to do that. Nah, that's boring. I don't want to do that. And so the law becomes the tutor that takes you to the cross, takes you to Messiah. And the more you understand about the law, the more you understand that you're not keeping it. When I witness to people and point out, well, there's 613 laws, and if you follow them all perfectly, you can, in fact, earn your salvation. And everybody uniformly says, well, that's impossible. And I say, exactly. No one has done it. You're not going to meet anybody in heaven who says, hey, I got myself here. And so Paul points out this dichotomy. Back in Deuteronomy 30, verse 5, Moses writes about righteousness. Or I should say, he quotes from Deuteronomy 30. The man who does these things shall live by them. But the righteousness of faith speaks in this way. Do not say in your heart, who will ascend to heaven? That is, bring Christ down from above. Or who will descend into the abyss? That is, bring Christ up from the dead. But what does it say? The word is near you, in your mouth, in your heart. That is the word of faith which we preach. So he says the Jews are trying to be righteous by the law, but you have to go to Messiah. And he goes back to Deuteronomy 30, which of course is Torah. People say, oh, I don't like to read, that's boring. I don't understand any of that. Well, Deuteronomy 30 is Torah, and it says there, you don't have to ascend to heaven to find the word. You don't have to go across the ocean. You don't have to go into the abyss. The word is in you. It's near you. It's in your mouth. It's in your heart. And Paul says that's the faith that we preach. It isn't just intellectual knowledge about Yeshua because you read a couple of books about him. This is the faith that we preach. That if you confess with your mouth the Lord Jesus and believe in your heart that God has raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For with the heart one believes unto righteousness, and with the mouth confession is made unto salvation. So you believe in your heart, you publicly confess it, and you will be saved. Now, believing in your heart, remember, ancient people thought the heart was the center of all of your emotions and the center of all your humanity, so to speak. Paul's talking about something very deep. He's not talking about intellectual knowledge that you know about somebody named Jesus of Nazareth. This is a deep, profound knowledge. That's why it says in your heart. You believe who he is. You believe that he was raised from the dead. You will be saved. Yes, you should keep the moral law. Yes, you should study and pray and keep the Sabbath and do all the things. But this is where salvation is. And so this is a great change from Saul of Tarsus. And he's basically saying here, these things are not complicated. None of these things are some esoteric concepts that are way far somewhere that somebody has to go get them. Because you have to travel overseas to find them. Or you have to go to heaven to look for it, or go into the abyss to look for it. No. Deuteronomy had said this. Yeshua said the kingdom of God is within you in John 17:21. So he's also referring back to Deuteronomy 30. So his teaching, his gospel, the gospel that John's outlining, and this passage from Romans that we're looking at that Paul is describing are all tied back to Torah in Deuteronomy 30. Jesus does not say, forget about Torah. We don't care about that. Nobody cares about that anymore. Paul does not say, forget about Torah. Nobody cares about that anymore. All these things are tied together. So the things are not complicated. We can find it. We don't have to go far away to look for it. And he says, this is the faith that we preach. This is what the promise of salvation is. This is the new covenant. That's why Jeremiah 31:31 says it's a new covenant. It's not like the original covenant. The law is written in your heart, and no one has to say, how do I know God? You'll know him. In the covenant of the law, it says keep the law. It doesn't say anything about knowing God. It says keep the law. But here, and again tying back to Deuteronomy, and again now even tying back to Jeremiah 31:31 and following, when you come into this new covenant, you'll know him, capital H. You'll know him. And this is the promise of salvation. But he says confession and faith are needed. It doesn't automatically apply to everyone who shows up. This is not the concept of everybody gets a trophy so that people don't feel bad. There's going to be plenty of people feeling bad at the judgment. Plenty of people feeling bad. Confession and faith are needed. It's not automatically applied to everyone. So Paul ties all of this together in a very powerful way. Deep conviction We know that the heart is just a water pump. It's actually two water pumps side by side. It's a very simple organ, really, compared to almost all the other organs. The heart's one of the simplest organs. But, of course, it's very vital in that you don't have a lot of time to continue living if it completely fails. But the ancients felt that that was the center of your life, the center of your emotions. So that was the deep conviction. And then the mouth confesses it. It shall come to pass that whoever calls upon the name of the Lord will be saved. The salvation message is really pretty simple. So this is what Paul's getting at. Even here, this is Linus from Joel chapter 2. Of course, another verse from the prophets, another verse from one of the minor prophets, second in the list of 12, written long before Yeshua was born, says, call on the name of the Lord, you'll be saved. Well, when you're living in a covenant of the law, you're not saved by calling on the name of the Lord. You're saved by keeping the law. Here he says, you call on the Lord, you'll be saved. Paul's tying this together as well. So then he goes on back to Romans 10. How then shall they call on him in whom they have not believed? And how shall they believe in him of whom they have not heard? And how shall they hear without a preacher? And how shall they preach unless they are sent? So here he constructs a logical argument. He says, how are they going to call on him if they've never heard of him? How are they going to believe in somebody they've never heard of? How's that going to happen without somebody telling them? Without somebody teaching them? And how is somebody going to teach them, to tell them, if no one is sent? We live in our time that we're here now, the mission field's never been bigger. I always like to point out that the great churches in Europe and America and sent missionaries all over the world to bring the gospel. Now they have to send the missionaries down to the corner because you have great empty cathedrals surrounded by people who have no clue what used to go on in there, no clue of what the gospel is. So Paul says you have to send people to teach. Faith doesn't come in a vacuum. This is how Paul brought the promise to the Gentiles. He preached to them. He spent days and weeks and months, a year and a half at Corinth, teaching, preaching, because this has to be made known to them. And their standing before God has to be made known to them, just like it has to be known to your coworkers and your family members and your neighbors and the people at the grocery store. Because everybody says, everything's cool. I'm okay, you're okay. Whatever you believe is fine. Whatever you want to do is fine. Oh, it's good for you if you believe that, but I don't believe that. You have to make that known to them. And like I said, the mission fields hasn't been this big since the first century. It's really amazing what's happened. We've seen the great falling away that Paul talks about in 2 Thessalonians. It didn't happen over the last 10 to 20 years. I don't know exactly. But this is how Paul taught. When he met the philosophers on the Areopagus, he said, you guys, you're very religious. I see you're very religious. You got gods all over the place. And then I found this one altar to the unknown God, because they just wanted to make sure if they left out any of the gods, they wanted to cover that. So they had an altar to the unknown God. So Paul uses this to teach. It says, well, I'll tell you about this God. He made everything. He made everybody. He put people where they're supposed to be, when they're supposed to be there. And then he goes on to tell these guys, God overlooked all this stuff you guys are doing, your paganism and your way of life, but he's not going to overlook it any longer. There's going to come a time where you're going to be judged for this. And this Jewish Messiah I'm telling you about is going to be the one who's going to judge you. And they said, okay, well, whatever. What is this babble they're trying to say? And finally they said, well, we'll get back to you on that. Because they couldn't understand what he was talking about, but he was teaching them. He was trying to make them understand that without Messiah, all they had was their false gods and their false ways of life and their false culture. And none of those gods that apparently in ancient Athens, and I always think Saul as a Pharisee would have just been overwhelmed. Apparently there are shrines and altars and temples on every block. Couldn't walk around the city without seeing hundreds of images. And he's telling them, God's overlooked all of this. But he's not going to overlook it any longer. And that's the teaching that you do in a mission field. Yeah, that mission field. We have the mission field that we're in now. And it's huge. Even the church has to be evangelized again. Most of the church is now off the rails. You don't have to go very far to see that. But anyway, so he says, you got to teach. And as he points out in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, we're ambassadors. We're the ones that go out and talk about the plan. We're the ones that go out and bring the news. We're the ones that go to the Areopagus and say, you know what? The way you guys are living, the true God's not going to tolerate that much longer. Right now, you're in a time of grace. You have time to repent. You have time to turn your life around. But that's not always going to be the case. So he went to these guys, and these philosophers were smart guys. He went and tried to bring the good news to them. Because after all, what's important is how we bring the good news to people. Isaiah 52 talks about how important this is. Verse 7, how beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of him who brings good news, who proclaims peace, who brings glad tidings of good things, who proclaims salvation. This is written 700 years before Yeshua was even born. And here again, someone who proclaims salvation is bringing good news. Their feet are beautiful because they're coming and bringing the word of salvation. And this is the point that Paul's making here in Romans chapter 10. Saul of Tarsus was very well acquainted with these passages. He was very well acquainted with everything that Isaiah wrote, that all the prophets wrote. very well acquainted with every phrase in Torah. And he uses these things as a basis. And like he starts out the chapter by saying the most important thing is for Israel to be saved. Here there's a reference back to what good news it is to somebody who brings the news of salvation, somebody who proclaims salvation. And he says, that's what I've been doing. In so many places, he says, that's what I do. I preach to the Gentiles. I tell them the good news. So he says, someone is sent, someone tells the good news, and it brings salvation. And so he underscores all these things as how you bring people into the kingdom. It doesn't happen by osmosis. And just like he was used, we're used. I want to say a little bit about chapter 10, but I don't want to start on that now because the time is rapidly ticking away. But hope I have to continue that for next week. But you see the point here, of the point he's trying to make. Yeshua is the endpoint of the law. The law was all pointing to him. He's the substance, capital S. And we have to be able to proclaim that substance, capital S, and salvation. And people have to go and teach this and preach it. And people have to be sent in order to do this. Whew. So I'm going to cut it off there because my time's up, and we'll continue this next week.